The wind howling across the Dakota plains carried a bite that felt less like weather and more like a personal grievance, a shapeless entity intent on stripping the warmth from the marrow of anyone foolish enough to remain under the open sky. May stood alone in this vast white purgatory, the hem of her gray prairie dress stiff with frozen mud and ice, acting as a heavy anchor that threatened to pull her down into the snow. She was 29 years old, though the lines etched around her eyes by the blinding sun and the relentless worry of the last 3 years made her look older, her youth eroded by the harsh attrition of the frontier. Behind her, wrapped in a canvas tarp that had once covered their wagon during the long, hopeful journey west, lay the body of her husband, Chin. He had been a man of quiet strength and gentle hands, hands that had calloused over in their attempt to coax life from this unforgiving soil, but the fever had taken him quickly, stealing his breath in the night, and leaving May with nothing but silence and a debt to the earth that she now had to pay. She gripped the rough hemp rope attached to the makeshift travois she had constructed from broken fence posts, her knuckles white and cracking in the biting cold. Every step up the rise toward the solitary oak tree, the only landmark for miles, was a battle against physics and despair, the runners of the sled groaning against the crust of the snow. She pulled until her lungs burned with the intake of frigid air, her boots slipping on the hidden patches of ice beneath the powder, forcing her to drop to her knees and crawl, dragging the weight of her past life behind her. The isolation was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled even her own sobbing breath, leaving her in a vacuum where the only reality was the pain in her shoulders and the stiff, unyielding body of the man she had crossed an ocean to be with. She did not look back at the cabin, a small, dark square in the distance where the fire had long since burned down to ash, for there was nothing left there to comfort her, only the echo of a cough and the empty space where a future was supposed to be. The ground beneath the oak tree was not merely frozen, it was petrified, a solid slab of iron disguised as earth that refused to yield to the meager tools May had brought with her. She struck the ground with the spade, the metal ringing out with a sharp, high-pitched clang that vibrated up her arms and settled as a dull ache in her teeth. But the earth did not break, only chipping away in tiny, insignificant shards of ice and dirt. She struck again and again, her breath misting in ragged clouds before her face, fueled by a desperation that bordered on madness because she knew she could not leave him above ground, not here where the wolves sang their hunger to the moon every night. The wind picked up, whipping her black hair across her face, blinding her momentarily, but she pushed the hair back with a dirty, trembling hand and swung the shovel with all the remaining force in her small, starving frame. The blade hit a submerged rock, the impact jarring her bones, and with a sickening snap, the wooden handle splintered, leaving her holding a useless piece of wood while the metal blade lay mocking her on the frost. May stared at the broken tool, the reality of her situation crashing down on her with the weight of a mountain. She was alone, thousands of miles from the village of her birth, with a husband she could not bury, and a winter that showed no mercy. She fell to her knees, not in prayer, for she felt the heavens had turned their back on this place long ago, but in sheer physical collapse, scraping at the hard ground with her bare fingers until her nails broke and the blood smeared dark and stark against the white snow. It was in this moment of utter defeat, with her forehead pressed against the frozen earth and her tears freezing on her cheeks, that a sound cut through the wind, not the howl of a wolf, but the rhythmic, heavy crunch of hooves breaking through the snow crust. She froze, the instinct of prey taking over, and slowly raised her head to see a silhouette cresting the ridge, a dark figure on a large horse, indistinguishable against the blinding gray sky, watching her with the stillness of a hawk. The rider did not advance immediately, sitting high in the saddle with a posture that suggested a lifetime spent on horseback. his figure etched against the horizon like a scar on the landscape. May scrambled to her feet, wiping the blood from her hands onto her dress, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For in this lawless expanse, a stranger was rarely a harbinger of kindness. She looked around for a weapon, but the broken shovel handle was all she had, a pathetic defense against a man who undoubtedly carried iron on his hip. The horse snorted, a plume of steam erupting from its nostrils, and the rider nudged the beast forward, descending the slope with a slow, deliberate pace that felt less like a threat and more like a procession. As he drew closer, the details of his existence resolved themselves from the gray blur. He was a man weathered by the elements, his coat made of heavy shearling worn smooth at the elbows, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that were hidden in shadow. This was Samuel, though May did not know his name yet, a drifter whose own history was written in the jagged lines of his face and the quiet way he held himself. A man who had seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize the specific shape of grief when he saw it. He stopped the horse 10 yards from where she stood, guarding the tarp-wrapped body, the leather of his saddle creaking in the silence. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the wind filling the space between them, and May tensed, waiting for a demand, a threat, or the casual cruelty she had learned to expect from those who looked at her face and saw only a foreigner. But Samuel did not speak. Instead, his gaze moved from her defensive stance to the broken shovel lying in the snow, and then to the shrouded form of Chin. His expression did not change. No pity softened the hard set of his jaw, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to drop, a subtle shift from wariness to resignation. He swung his leg over the saddle horn and dropped to the ground, the thud of his boots heavy and solid, and began to untie a pickaxe and a long-handled spade from his pack, his movements slow and devoid of aggression, ignoring her terror as if it were merely another part of the biting cold. Samuel walked past her, giving her a wide berth as one might give a frightened animal, and approached the shallow scratch marks she had made in the earth. He did not ask for permission, nor did he offer a greeting, understanding perhaps that words were too light a currency for the gravity of this scene. He spit on his gloves, rubbed them together, and raised the pickaxe, bringing it down with a grunt of exertion that seemed to come from the bottom of his lungs. The steel tip bit into the frozen ground, cracking the surface that had defeated her, and he pulled back, tearing up a chunk of frost-hardened sod. He struck again, a steady, rhythmic cadence establishing itself, a metronome of labor in the silent wasteland. May watched him, her grip on the broken handle loosening, confusion warring with relief in her chest. She watched the muscles of his back shift under the heavy coat, the steam rising from his neck, and realized he was not taking over the task to dismiss her, but simply stepping into the yoke of the burden because it was too heavy for one. Slowly, tentatively, she moved toward the hole, picking up the metal spade head that had snapped off, using it like a hand trowel. When Samuel broke the earth loose with the pick, she knelt and scooped the debris away, her hands working in tandem with his rhythm. They worked like this for hours, the sun beginning its slow, bleeding descent toward the western mountains, painting the snow in hues of violet and bruised orange. No words were exchanged, only the heavy breathing of two people exerting themselves against the indifference of nature, a silent partnership forged in the necessity of the moment. The hole deepened, inch by hard-won inch, deep enough to protect what lay within from the scavengers, deep enough to offer the dignity of rest. May's arms trembled uncontrollably, her strength failing. But every time she faltered, Samuel would pause, leaning on his pickaxe, waiting without judgment until she found the breath to continue, his presence a silent pillar that kept her from collapsing. By the time the grave was finished, the light had largely drained from the sky, leaving a twilight that felt suspended in time, the air growing colder and sharper. Samuel climbed out of the waist-deep pit and reached a hand down to May. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before taking it, his grip rough and calloused, but undeniably warm against her freezing skin. He hoisted her up with an ease that surprised her, setting her gently on the edge of the excavation. Together, they moved to the sled, and without needing to be asked, Samuel took the shoulders of the shrouded form, while May took the feet. The weight of Chin seemed heavier now, as if the finality of the moment had added physical mass to his body, but they carried him with a solemn grace, lowering him slowly into the dark earth. May stood at the edge, looking down at the canvas, the silence of the plains suddenly deafening, the wind having died down as if out of respect for the passage. She did not weep now. She had spent her tears on the journey up the hill, and now she felt hollowed out, a vessel emptied by loss. Samuel stepped back, removing his hat and holding it against his chest, his head bowed, his breath misting in the gloom. He waited until she nodded, a small, jerky motion of her chin, before he began to shovel the dirt back in, the sound of the soil hitting the canvas the most final sound May had ever heard. When the mound was raised and packed down, Samuel turned away, gathering dry brush from a nearby thicket and retrieving a small tin pot from his saddlebags. He built a small fire near the grave, the flames leaping up to push back the encroaching night, and set water to boil. "Coffee," he said, the first word he had spoken, his voice gravelly and low, unused to conversation. He poured a cup and held it out to her, the steam rising between them, an offering of heat and humanity in the center of the vast, cold dark. May took the cup, her fingers brushing his, and nodded, her voice a whisper that barely carried over the crackle of the fire. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate but filled with a profound, exhausted sincerity. Samuel merely nodded, staring into the fire, a sentinel keeping watch over her grief. The fire at the graveside began to sputter, the meager pile of brush consumed by the hungry flames and the encroaching snow that hissed as it hit the embers, signaling that the vigil was over. Samuel kicked snow over the remaining coals, extinguishing the only source of light in the vast darkness, and the sudden plunge into obscurity made the world feel impossibly large and hostile. "Horse can't stay out in this," he said, his voice flat and practical, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over May. She nodded, though he likely couldn't see it, and gathered her skirts, her legs numb and responding sluggishly to her commands. They began the trek back to the cabin, the black square of its structure barely visible against the night sky, a fragile shelter against the leviathan of the winter storm that was gathering strength in the north. Samuel led his horse by the reins, the animal's head bowed low against the wind, its hooves stumbling occasionally in the deep drifts that had accumulated while they worked. May walked a few paces behind, her eyes fixed on the back of Samuel's coat, using his form as a windbreak, her mind a chaotic swirl of exhaustion and a strange, detached gratitude. When they reached the cabin, the door creaked on leather hinges that had stiffened in the freeze, opening into a room that held the chill of the grave they had just filled. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of stale sage, sickness, and the lingering, ghostly presence of the life that had just been extinguished. Samuel did not hesitate. He tied the horse to the rail of the small lean-to that served as a porch, draped a heavy blanket over the beast's flanks, and followed May inside, filling the small space with his looming height and the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. He stood by the door, awkward for the first time, realizing he was an intruder in a sanctuary of grief, his eyes scanning the dim room illuminated only by the moonlight spilling through the single small window. May moved to the cast-iron stove in the center of the room, her hands trembling as she reached for the matchbox, the simple act of lighting a fire feeling like an insurmountable task. Seeing her struggle, Samuel stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and gently took the matches from her fingers. "Sit," he murmured, kneeling before the iron belly of the stove. May sank onto the rough-hewn bench at the table, watching as this stranger coaxed a spark into life, the yellow flare illuminating the hollows of his face and the grim determination set there. He fed kindling into the grate with a reverence usually reserved for prayer, understanding that in this country fire was the only god that listened. The heat from the stove grew slowly, radiating outward to touch the frozen corners of the room, thawing the frost that had begun to creep across the inside of the window pane in fern-like patterns. Samuel stood up, dusting the ash from his hands, and looked around the cabin with a critical, appraising eye, noting the drafts whistling through the chinking in the logs, and the sparse shelves that spoke of a pantry dangerously close to empty. He did not ask about her situation. The emptiness of the flour sack and the way the wind rattled the door in its frame told him everything he needed to know about the desperation that lived here. "I'll see to the stock if you have any," he said, moving toward the door again, unable to sit idle while the storm worsened. May looked up, her eyes dark and rimmed with red. "One cow," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse, "in the shed back of the house, and 3 chickens." Samuel nodded, pulling his hat lower. "I'll bring in wood," he added, and then he was gone, slipping back into the howling night. May remained at the table, the silence returning, but it was different now. It was punctuated by the rhythmic thwack of an axe striking wood outside, a steady, percussive heartbeat that reassured her she was not the only living thing left in the universe. She forced herself to stand, the circulation returning to her feet in painful prickles, and moved to the basin to wash the graveyard dirt from her hands. The water in the pitcher had a thin crust of ice that she had to break, the shock of the cold against her skin serving to sharpen her senses. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing a stranger staring back, a woman stripped down to her elemental self. She turned away and began to scour the pantry for something to offer the man who was currently chopping fuel for her survival. She found a jar of preserved peaches and a small sack of cornmeal, meager offerings that felt inadequate for the debt she owed, but it was all she had. She mixed the meal with water and a pinch of salt to make hot water cornbread, placing the skillet on the stove top. When Samuel kicked the door open 10 minutes later, his arms laden with split logs that reached his chin, the smell of cooking batter hit him, and for a fleeting second, the hard lines of his face softened. He dropped the wood into the box with a heavy clatter, shaking the snow from his shoulders like a wet dog. "Storm's turning," he said, moving to the stove to warm his hands. "It'll be a hard night." The wind rose to a scream as the night deepened, a relentless assault that battered the small cabin as if trying to pry it from the earth's surface. The timbers groaned under the pressure, pop and snapping in the cold like gunfire, and every draft that sneaked through the moss and mud chinking felt like a knife blade. They ate in silence, the simple meal of cornbread and peaches disappearing quickly, the hunger of physical labor overriding the need for conversation. Samuel ate with a focused intensity, wiping the plate clean with the last crust of bread, while May picked at her portion, the knot in her stomach making it difficult to swallow. When the meal was done, Samuel pushed his plate away and looked at the door, which was rattling violently against its latch. "That latch won't hold," he muttered, standing up and moving to inspect the iron hardware. The metal was old and pitted with rust, and with every gust the door jumped in the frame, threatening to burst open and let the blizzard claim the room. He looked around for something to brace it with, his eyes landing on the heavy oak table they had just eaten off. Without a word, he grabbed the edge of the table and dragged it across the uneven floor, the legs screeching in protest, until he wedged it firmly against the door. "That'll do for now," he said, but his eyes remained wary. May watched him, realizing that his presence was the only thing standing between her and a death by freezing. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to speak, to bridge the gap between them. "He built this place," she said softly, looking at the ceiling beams. "Chin. He cleared the land himself." Samuel turned to look at her, leaning back against the table he had just positioned. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false praise. He simply nodded, acknowledging the labor of the dead man. "He cut good notches," Samuel said, gesturing to the corner joins of the logs. "Tight fits. Kept you safe this long." It was the highest compliment a man like him could give, a validation of Chin's worth measured in survival. The wind shrieked again, a banshee wail that vibrated through the floorboards, and the lamp flickered, casting jumping shadows against the walls. For the next few hours they sat on the floor near the stove, the warmest spot in the room, wrapped in blankets. Samuel took a knife from his belt, not to carve but to clean his fingernails, a mundane, human habit that anchored the scene in reality. They spoke little, but the silence was companionable rather than oppressive. Two soldiers sharing a foxhole while the artillery pounded the earth outside. Morning broke not with sunlight, but with a gray, diffused luminescence that filtered through the heavy drift of snow covering the bottom half of the window. The wind had died down to a low moan, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Samuel was the first to move, unfolding his stiff limbs from the rug where he had dozed fitfully, his hand instinctively going to the revolver on his hip before his mind caught up to where he was. He stood and moved the heavy table away from the door, the wood groaning as he relieved the pressure. When he lifted the latch and pushed, the door didn't budge, blocked by the snow that had piled up against it during the night. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with effort, and shoved hard. The door cracked open, shoving a wedge of white powder across the floor, and a blast of Arctic air rushed in, instantly dropping the temperature in the room. May sat up, pulling her shawl tighter, blinking against the harsh white glare. Samuel grabbed the shovel he had brought in the night before and began to dig a path out, tossing the snow over his shoulder into the room until he could squeeze through the opening to clear the porch. May rose and went to the stove, stirring the embers from the night before, feeding them the last of the wood in the box. She could hear the rhythmic scraping of the shovel outside, the sound of a world being excavated. When Samuel returned, his face was red from the cold, his breath coming in clouds. "Drifts are 5 feet in places," he reported, stomping his boots, "but the sky is clearing." He looked at her, and the inevitability of his departure hung in the air between them. He didn't belong here. He was a creature of the trail, a man who moved because stopping meant thinking about things he kept buried. He drank the coffee she made, weak and bitter, the dregs of the canister, standing up, his eyes already on the horizon visible through the open door. "I'll chop enough wood to fill the lean-to before I go," he said, setting the cup down. "Check the roof, too. Make sure the wind didn't loosen any shingles." It was an offer of service that went beyond immediate survival. It was an attempt to future-proof her existence, a way to ensure she survived the winter he wouldn't be part of. May looked at him, feeling a sharp pang of panic at the thought of being alone again, but she swallowed it down. She was a widow of the plains now. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. The sun was high and blinding by the time Samuel finished his work. The sound of the axe had ceased, replaced by the stomp of his horse as he tightened the cinch. The lean-to was stacked floor to ceiling with split logs, a wall of security that smelled of sap and oak. May stood on the porch wearing Chin's heavy coat which engulfed her small frame, the sleeves rolled up to free her hands. She held a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, bread she had baked that morning, and a strip of dried beef she had been saving for a special occasion. She held it out to him as he checked the stirrup leather. "For the road," she said, her voice steady. Samuel looked at the bundle, then at her face, his blue eyes searching hers for a moment. He took the food, nodding his thanks, and tucked it into his saddlebag. He didn't mount immediately. Instead, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small folding knife with a bone handle, placing it on the railing of the porch. "Keep it sharp," he said. "Good steel." It was a trade, practical and devoid of sentimentality, yet weighted with meaning. He swung himself up into the saddle, the leather creaking, and gathered the reins. The horse danced sideways, eager to run after the confinement of the storm. Samuel looked down at her one last time, tipping the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect, not romance. "You keep that fire fed, ma'am," he said. He turned the horse and rode toward the ridge, the animal cutting a dark path through the pristine snow. May did not wave. She stood motionless, watching him shrink into the distance until he was nothing more than a speck against the blinding white of the mountains. When he disappeared over the crest, the silence rushed back in, vast and overwhelming, but she did not crumble. She looked at the wall of wood he had left, the repaired fence, the smoke curling from her chimney. She picked up the knife he had left, feeling the cold weight of it in her palm, and tested the edge with her thumb. It was sharp. She turned back to the cabin, stepped inside, and closed the door firmly against the cold. There was work to be done.